Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. We are very much privileged to have you join us today. Sorry about that technical hiccup. We were expecting to have a welcome video from our Vice President at the Centre for Tourism Research at Wakayama University, Professor Adachi. Perhaps we will have the welcome video now.
Our distinguished guests, speakers, and participants, warm greetings from Center for Tourism Research, Wakayama University, Japan. I am Professor Motohiro Adachi, Director of the Center for Tourism and the Vice President here at Wakayama University, Japan. The Center for Tourism Research is keen to build up its profile as a hub for tourism research in Asian Pacific. This webinar focus upon tourism in Asian century is very relevant to our work, and we congratulate the organizers of this conference, including Tourism Geography Journal, Critical Tourism Studies Asian Pacific, International Geographical Union Tourism Commission, Association of American Geographers, Recreation, Tourism, and Sports Group. Once again, the Center for Tourism Research, Wakayama University is very pleased to be hosting this event. We wish you a very productive and insightful webinar. Thank you very much, and with best wishes.
Okay, without further ado, thank you, Professor Motohiro Adachi. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending where you are joining in from. We've got a lot of people from all over the globe here at the moment. Good morning to Claudio and Maartje and Gabriel in Europe. Good evening to Regina in New Zealand, and then good day to everybody else around the world. It's a privilege to have you all join us today. Thank you for making the time to join us for this official launch of the special issue, Recentering Tourism Geographies in the Asian Century, Volume 23, Issue 4 of Tourism Geographies. As usual, these things take time, and we finally got to the end of the process of publishing the special issue. I'm Joseph Chia, based here at Wakayama University, and I'll be moderating the webinar today along with Hung Lu Sin, who's in Singapore, and Mary Mostafanejad, who's in Oregon at the moment. Particular acknowledgements are due to all of the authors of the papers in the special issue, and most of them are here with us today. We obviously don't have a special issue without the work of authors, so we're very grateful for all of the work that they put into that. And also for the audience members, this is obviously a very good time for you to put a face to a name. Many of the papers you would have read, it's nice to meet the people behind the papers, right? So we hope that you will enjoy this. Special thanks go to Professor Alan Liu, the founding editor of Tourism Geographies, who accommodated this special issue. And of course, the leading editors, Mary and Hung Lu, for bringing this to fruition. We thank Critical Tourism Studies Asia Pacific, where this has come from, the International Geographical Union Tourism Commission, and the AAG Recreation, Tourism and Sport. So some practical housekeeping matters I'm sure we all are familiar with now. Mute your microphone to avoid feedback and background noise. And of course, if you need to ask a question, the chat function is open for you to be able to do that. So we have a full program over the next couple of hours. And to give you a quick overview, in the first instance, we will have 3 keynotes. The first one is from TC Chang, who's in Singapore, from Professor Kathleen Adams, who's in Sonoma, California, and Professor Tim Oakes, who's in Colorado, I believe. Yes. Okay. And then after the keynotes, rather than have Q&A after each keynote, we'll allocate some time to engage with all 3 keynotes at once. Then after the keynotes, this will be followed by an opportunity to engage with the authors via a research roundtable. What a roundtable means we get an opportunity to have a back and forth conversation. And that will bring us to the end of the webinar today. So without further delay, I will hand over to Hung Lu and Mary to take proceedings from here. Over to you.
So thank you everyone for joining us today at the launch of our special issue in Tourism Geographies titled Recentering Tourism Geographies in the Asian Century. And so as Joseph mentioned, we're very happy to have with us our 3 keynotes, and also almost all of our authors from our bumper special issue with actually 15 articles. So we're very happy to have everyone here today. Thank you for making the time. It is pretty late, especially for 2 of our keynotes in the USA. And, we are very glad that they are able to join us despite, all these time differences. So this special issue is many years in the making. We first met in Yogyakarta for the inaugural Critical Tourism Studies Asia Pacific Conference in 2018, when Mary, Joseph, and I, and the rest of our organizing committee were sort of going into this blind. We had an idea that there was a need to have a critical tourism studies meeting here in Asia Pacific region, so that it makes it easier for scholars based in Asia Pacific to attend and engage with the broader kind of critical tourism studies community. So Mary first mooted this idea to me when we were in Las Vegas at an AAG conference. So knowing how my colleagues from Singapore and elsewhere in Asia typically fly close to 20 hours to get to these meetings, I immediately agreed, this is a fantastic idea, very necessary. So we mounted on planning this inaugural conference with our colleagues at Università Gajah Mada. But to be honest, when we started out, we weren't actually sure who was going to come, what kind of, what would it turn out to be, what sort of community CTS-AP was going to build. And to say that I think we succeeded far beyond our very imagination at the beginning, I think is to put things very humbly. I'm very, very proud of the inclusive yet critical community that we have built in CTS-AP. And this special issue is a sort of essence of some of the extraordinarily fruitful and critical discussions from what was going on within the CTS-AP community, whether in this conference and beyond. And so today we are very happy to share this again with all of you. But this special issue is also, I would like to highlight, it's just the tip of an iceberg. We met again at Wakayama University, CTS-AP, the second conference, just before COVID, just as COVID was emerging in February 2020. And on hindsight, we have to sincerely say that we are really glad that we didn't cancel the conference out of some of our initial panicky fears of not knowing what to expect, being so worried that our conference was going to end up being a super spreader event. And trust me when I say this is probably one of the most stressful events we have had to organize, wondering, where we're going to get thermometers and, face masks and things like that. But this ended up being one of the last in-person conference for many of us, and it's something that I think that we hold quite dearly too. And we also hope very, very sincerely that eventually we'll get to meet as planned for the third CTS-AP conference in December of 2022, next year, in Vietnam National University in Hanoi. We really hope we can meet again in person. But before then, we make do and we meet online as we do today. And even though we don't get our hugs and our cheers as we did in person in like how it was in the last two conferences, I'm just happy, really happy to be in the presence of most of my favorite scholars in the world. I think it gives me this warm, fuzzy feeling of togetherness, despite what has been a very tough and isolating almost 2 years of a pandemic. And I also would like to say that if you are new, especially to the participants here, if you're new to us, joining us today for the first time, then I would really extend an invitation to you to join our critical yet loving, inclusive and diverse community of critical tourism scholars from the Asia Pacific, or in love with the Asia Pacific. Mary, next, up to you next.
Great, thanks, Honglu. Yeah, I just want to echo what Joseph and Honglu have already said. We really hope that this special issue is not the end, but in fact, the beginning of a broader conversation about global tourism, as well as its role in ongoing geopolitical shifts, hence the title of the special issue, Recentering Tourism in the Asia Pacific, or in the Asian century. So we have a long list of friends and colleagues that we want to thank for their role in the issue. First of all, we'd like to thank the Critical Tourism Studies founders and participants who helped shape the field. And particularly, we'd like to thank Irina Achevic, Candace Harris, Nigel Morgan, and Annette Pritchard, who each had a pivotal role in establishing critical tourism studies as a field of study. We would also like to thank the hosts of the first biennial CTS Asia Pacific Conference, which was held at Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. We offer a special thanks to the organizers, which include, but definitely we're not limited to, Mark Hampton, who was the chair of the event, David Sanders, Jasmine Zhang, Adam Doring, and Roger Norum. And we'd also like to thank the keynotes, including Windu Nirayanti, Jan Plessy, Regina Scheyvens, Chris Gibson, Tim Edenser, Strom McCole, Kathleen Adams, and Hazel Tucker, many who are here today. We'd also like to thank the host of the second CTS Asia Pacific Conference at Wakayama University in Japan, with particular thanks again to Adam, who was pivotal in both the first and the second conferences, as well as Kaori Yanada and Kumi Kato, as well as the student volunteers for leading the organization of the conference alongside the CTS Executive Committee, including Jeremy Lamari, Guido, Hazel Tucker, and others. We'd also like to thank the keynotes at that event, including Hideki Endo, Tony Wheeler, Shinji Yamashita, Christine Yano, and Tazim Jamal. For many of us, as Hong Lu has already explained, that was the last conference we attended in person. So it was a very we look back on that conference, despite all the challenges, that were very nostalgic for being able to gather in person. We'd also like to thank Alan Liu, who shepherded each paper from submission through production, and of course, each of the authors in the issue, as well as all of the anonymous reviewers. And we can't forget the host of the what we hope to be the third Critical Tourism Studies Asia Pacific Conference, which is scheduled to be held in Hanoi, Vietnam in December 2022. Especially Long Hong Pham at Vietnam National University Hanoi, who will chair the event. And finally, we would like to thank all of you for being here today. We appreciate your interest as well as your support, and we look forward to hopefully gathering around bowls of pho 15 months from now in Hanoi.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Hong Lu. As I was saying to the other speakers before in the briefing session, it's really like gathering together before the first keynotes, right? Out in the coffee room, having a chat, catching up, but virtually, of course. So without further ado, we would like to start with the first of the three keynotes, and I will ask Hong Lu to introduce her former colleague, TC Chang, who will be the first keynote. Hong Lu.
Okay, so I'm really happy today to start with our first keynote, Associate Professor TC Chang, to share his views on Asianizing the field in tourism studies. TC is a very special mentor of mine, having taught me geography since I was 19 years old, and really shaping much of my, as well as many scholars' conceptualizations of tourism in the Asia Pacific in so many ways. TC has also, since our paper in this special issue, published another related article in the Annals of Tourism Research on Anglo and Asia centricism in tourism. And so I'm really very excited to hear what he has to say about his thoughts further to what he has already published in our special issue. And I'll stop stealing your time from TC now. So TC, please start when you're ready.
Okay, just hello everybody. Hong Lu, can you see the first screen? Which is, yes, okay, the title page. Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Joseph, Mary, and Hong Lu for inviting me to this symposium. So basically, we're talking a little bit about our paper as well as in this presentation. So the title, as you all know, is Asianizing the Field, Questioning CTS in Asia. Now, I start off by premising this talk, realizing that critical scholars ask questions all the time, right? We unmask stereotypes, we try to understand divergent viewpoints. So the importance of asking questions is undoubted in any critical scholarship. And for CTS in Asia, well, Hong Lu calls it CTSAP, right? I think without knowing the nature of the beast, by asking many questions and hopefully proposing some possible answers, I think through those questions and possible answers, we get a sense of what CTSAP stands for. So what I propose is to identify 6 questions and try to answer the 6 questions, but perhaps focusing on 3 in particular. But before I begin with the 6 questions, let me just give an overview of what I think CTS stands for. 4 particular characteristics. Number 1, CTS is theoretical. It is informed by critical theory the sort of critical theory that came from long ago, at 1920s Frankfurt School, but has been updated by all kinds of critical theorists, and geographers and tourism scholars have been inspired by these kinds of theories. So number one, CTS is theoretically informed. Number two, CTS is activistic. This theoretical research seeks to address problems in society, particularly problems dealing with inequalities and injustice. So let's remember, second point, activism, activistic research. Thirdly, CTS research is concerned about the process of knowledge creation. So researchers are constantly reflecting on their positionality and constantly thinking about how to be enlightened in data collection and not just data generation, right? Not just writing about the data, but how do you collect the data? And lastly, and perhaps most obviously, critical tourism studies address critical issues of critical concern to the world. So it could be sustainable development goals and tourism, quality of life, and so forth. So I just want to just sum up in just this particular section, saying that CTS is theoretical, it has an activistic bent, it is concerned about knowledge creation process, and not just the knowledge itself. So how knowledge is created, so the epistemologies of knowledge. And finally, that the information and the data collected is not just for intellectual interest, but it has impact and significance in the real world, so to speak, right? So with this in mind, let's think a little bit more about what is CTS-AP. And so I thought we should have a few questions. Now, keeping in mind that this is tourism geographies, right? Our common passion, geographies. The 6 questions, maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally, I don't know, spell out this acronym PLACE, what PLACE with double P. And I thought we'll look through 6 questions relating to principle, pedagogy, language, authorship, concepts, and emancipation. Now, it's not possible in my remaining 15 minutes to go through all 6 questions. So I propose I will bring up all the 6 questions, but we'll deep dive into 3. So principle, language, and authorship, we'll go into it in greater detail. But for the others, I'll just bring up the question and just explain what the question is so as to get you to read the paper itself, right? So we'll go through this, flowing from, exactly as the word place is spelled out. So let's start with the very first question. And to me, it is important to ask this question, especially in CTS in Asia. Can Asian researchers be considered critical researchers if they do not fully endorse or subscribe to the traditional understanding of what CTS is? So CTS's principles, goals, and even the sort of language and discourse, right? So things on critical theory, the self and the other, and of course, all the related concerns of reflexivity, positionality, epistemology, emancipation, and social justice. Now, what if an Asian researcher writing about their work, not addressing these particular points? So I give you an example, just a personal example, right? Until I co-edited the book Asia on Tour in 2009, I was working on heritage issues, urban tourism in Asian cities, Singapore, and also regionalism and tourism in Southeast Asia. I must admit, I had not used anything critical theory as we know of specifically. I had not been specifically reflexive or focusing on emancipation and social justice issues. Does that mean that I was not a critical researcher? Must I have touched on those points in order to be considered a critical scholar? Earlier this year, when I submitted an article to Annals of Tourism Research, and I was talking about Chinese scholars, and not many of them deal with epistemological reflexivity issues. And a reviewer, of course, anonymous to me, but probably a Chinese reviewer, replied saying, well, Chinese scholars are not particularly, not all, but most are not particularly concerned about epistemological issues. But can you say that they're not critical? We are critical in our own ways. We are critical in fighting poverty. We are critical in addressing agendas of nation building and so forth. So just because they do not deal with critical theory, reflexivity, and epistemology, can you say that they're not critical? Indeed, many books, many articles use the term critical. But if you were to page through some of these books, neither do they actually address the issues of reflexivity, positionality, Frankfurt School critical thought, and so forth. And therefore, I come to ask this question, probably not an answer, it's still a question, right? Who then is critical and what is critical? Are there different approaches and different ways of being critical? Are there Western approaches in being critical, which I think we mentioned earlier, Joseph mentioned, Hang Lu mentioned them. The critical theory of the Frankfurt School, and then tourism scholars like John Tribe, Keith Hollenshed, using those ideas, or perhaps Capitalism and Critical Geography of Tourism by the late Stephen Britton in the early 90s, spurring a whole lot of economic geographers looking at critical geography of tourism, but linking it to capitalism. Or, as Mary mentioned earlier, Irina Ethel-Javik, Nigel Morgan, Annette Pritchett, and so forth. The late 2000s Hopeful Tourism Academy, so conferences and books that appeared from Eastern Europe about the late 2000s. What if Asian scholars do not explicitly address any of these fields? Does that make them less critical? Are they critical in their own ways? As the Chinese reviewer, or I think as a Chinese reviewer, addressing that question to me. So I'll leave it at that. Must Asian scholars address the principles, the values, and the lingo of critical scholarship in order to be considered critical? Can they not be critical in their own ways? Okay, so that's our first question. The second P question is pedagogy. So I won't go into it in detail. Suffice to say that the question here is, must critical tourism teaching, and we all teach tourism, right, in geography of tourism, sociology of tourism, tourism in an interdisciplinary manner, must all that we teach have a social activistic bent before it can be considered critical tourism teaching? Polytechnics teach about management issues. In geography, I teach about tourism impacts and so forth. There isn't so much of an activistic bent or a social agenda. Does it mean that, therefore, that I'm just teaching tourism as opposed to critical tourism? So that's the second question to keep in mind. A third question for me to deep dive into pertains to language. And the rather unusual question I have in mind is critical research confined to English language? Or is critical scholarship, does it transcend language? And the reason why I thought I've been thinking about this is Pao et al. In 2014, an ATR article had said that actually Chinese research is highly critical, but until they're translated, actually only the Chinese reading population would know about how critical they are, critical in all senses of the word, right? And so I appreciate Pao et al. Reviewing Chinese articles, Mandarin written, Chinese language articles, and then in a way translating the ideas, summarizing the ideas for a non-Chinese reading audience, and then surfacing what is critical and what is not critical. But until somebody does that, and this is like, I don't know, 40, 50-year review of Chinese articles, until somebody does that, are we therefore just saying the critical scholars are those who write in English, because that's basically the field that we are in, right? And so English as a universal language for academia, as a lingua franca, of course, critical ideas travel faster and wider, but does it mean that critical scholarship remains in the English-speaking world? I also begin to think of this idea, does English facilitate critical expression more so than other language. An urban scholar, Jira Praksakun, a Thai urban scholar, wrote about how in the Thai language, there isn't this term called loss of community, loss of place identity. It's just not part of the Thai lingo. And so the Thai scholars come across as not being critical when they address identity issues, because they don't have the lingo that English writers would talk about, the loss of sense of place, placelessness, non-places, and so forth. Victor Elnan wrote about how the Vietnamese language doesn't have an equivalent to the word kitsch. And so when we think of Dalat, his case study was on the hill resort of Dalat. Western writers, therefore English language writers, would critique the sort of problems they see in Dalat and calling it Vietnamese kitsch. It's the epitome of Vietnamese kitsch. But when he looked at how the Vietnamese describe Dalat, either in English or in many cases in their own language, and talking to the Vietnamese themselves, they don't have that particular equivalent language to express kitsch. And if anything, they actually delight in the romantic aura of Dalat. So what is one man's kitsch is another woman's romance. What is one person's treasure is another person's trash, right? And so they don't think of Dalat as kitschy, neither do they feel that it's kitschy, nor do they have that language to express it as such. Does it make them less critical? Okay, so that's my thinking about language as a vehicle to think through what is critical tourism studies, but in Asia Pacific. I move on to the third question, which I want to deep dive into. And this is a little bit sensitive. Can a non-Asian engage in, okay, so you have CTSAP, but actually I have cats, right? I'm a cat lover, I'm a dog lover. I was thinking of critical Asian tourism studies, but yeah, thanks Hang Lu, it should be Asia Pacific. So CAPTS, right? So can a non-Asian engage in CAPTS? So non-resident, so not living in Asia, doesn't speak any of the Asian language, a non-ethnic insider. Can a non-Asian engage in critical Asian tourism thought? Now, of course, you would say this is a moot question. Just look around the room. Well, actually, look around the Zoom, right? We have people who are non-Asian, perhaps non-vernacular speaking, non-ethnic insiders who are writing critical stuff. And so the answer is, of course, yes. Of course, I mean, Tim Oakes, Kathleen Adams, non-Asians who are empathetic outsiders. Yeah, they might be outsiders, but they're empathetic to the concerns, the aspirations of people and societies in Asia Pacific. But as Harris et al. Put it, critical researchers are also reflexive scholars, constantly thinking about their entanglements. Okay, so I'm female or I'm male, but I'm writing about Vietnam and I'm not Vietnamese. Critically reflecting and declaring your entanglement. So in that sense, yes, why not? A non-Asian can be critical. But having said that, Victor King and Ploy-Sri Porananon also say, as we have Westerners writing critical materials on Asia, we must still try to encourage more Asians to populate the field. We need more Asian scholars to Asianize the field. So have more Asians to speak their truth about Asia. Okay, so the next slide, please don't take offense. These are observations from my students when I talk about critical tourism studies and critical Asian tourism studies. Okay, so Tim Oakes, this is for you. So my students say, why are there 3 Tims? Edinson, Oakes, Winter. There are 2 Victors, Victor King, Victor Elnan, and 2 Cohens, well, actually probably many more Cohens. So where are the Changs? Where are the Sins? Where are the Paranonan? And so on and so forth, right? Isn't this critical Asian tourism studies? And indeed, Victor King himself pointed out in 2015 that the critical turn in Asian tourism seem to come primarily first from Western social scientists. And he goes on to name Victor Elnan, but he should name himself too, right? Tim Edinson, Tim Winter, and the Cohens. So where are the critical Asians? So basically, we go back to the point that we should try to populate the field, Asianize the field. According to Mura and Kuh-Lattimore, Asian authors do value add. Perhaps their immersion in Asia, growing up in Asia, speaking the Asian language, gives them access to Asian paradoxes and complexities, Asian thinking, Asian psychology, and so on and so forth, right? So as we continue to welcome non-Asians writing critical materials, let's also play up and encourage more Asian authors. Okay, so the last two questions will be just a touch and go. Concepts. Can one engage in critical Asian tourism studies without critiquing? Why can't we just apply concepts? Why can't we just agree and endorse concepts? Must we debunk concepts? Must we innovate new concepts in order to be seen as conceptually critical? And finally, what if our tourism scholarship is intellectual knowledge? It doesn't lead to a social end, an emancipatory outcome. Does that mean that we're not critical? Must all tourism scholarship, writing, teaching, end in emancipation? So that's a question to think about to complete the PLACE framework. So let me just summarize. I've identified 6 questions and I've deep dived into 3 specific questions. And I hope we'll be able to think through these 6 questions as we try to understand the properties and characteristics of critical tourism studies in the Asia Pacific. But you know, as you ask questions, more questions arise. So I'll end with 3 questions, 3 more questions that arise from my thinking through 6 questions. Number 1, am I defining critical too broadly? Well, as in anything which is interesting, critical to the government, am I defining critical far too widely, as opposed to keeping to, you know, the 4 halo principles of epistemology, theoretical, emancipatory, and so forth, right? Am I defining critical far too widely? So in the end, everything becomes critical and nothing becomes critical, number 1. A second question is, are there different ways of being critical? Is there an Asian way of being critical, which is not necessarily Western, and that thinking came about because of the Chinese reviewers saying, we are critical in our own ways. Are there different approaches to being critical, not necessarily addressing Stephen Britton, Irina Altajevic, and so on and so forth? And finally, my last point, as we critique Anglocentrism, is there a new center of intellectual gravity shifting to, in this case, Asia Pacific? Might we also not be accused of Asia centrism, Asia chauvinism, as we try to debunk Anglocentrism? So Hang Lu had mentioned an article that I've just penned in ATR, which basically addresses this question. As we all critique Anglocentrism, might we also not be creating a new form of centrism, Asia centrism? So I've only attended the very first CTS conference. Unfortunately, I was not able to meet all of you in Wakayama, but how wonderful the first conferences, meeting old friends and making new friends. And I hope to make more new friends in Hanoi next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, TC, for as always, you know, very clear and very insightful presentation. And in fact, when the special issue was first published fully online, one of my mentors from China, I shall not name who, asked why were there not as many like Asians in the authorship as she would have hoped. And you know, then my reply was that this is a work in progress, and this is something that CTSAP is still striving towards. Hopefully, we'll reach there at some point, while being very attentive to Asia insularities as well, as TC mentioned. So if you have any questions or comments for TC, you can put them into the chat, and then we'll come back at the end of all 3 keynotes to address all these questions together. And next, I'll invite Mary to introduce Caitlin.
Great, thanks, Honglu. Our next speaker, I feel like needs no introduction. I feel Kathleen Adams is Professor Emeritus from Loyola University in Chicago. She is an anthropologist who has worked for several decades in Indonesia, and when we were organizing the first conference, she definitely was the top of mind for all of us thinking about keynotes and who would be just the perfect keynote for our first conference in Yogyakarta. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Kathleen Adams.
I'm so sorry for that. Apologies, technical glitches. I'm going to share my screen first and foremost. Okay, should be popping up. It says sending the link. I am not sure why, but is the screen there? Are you seeing the screen?
No.
Okay, let me try it again. I apologize. For some reason, I'm being asked to share it to a specific group, which makes no sense, but I apologize for this. I may have to do it without. I'll give it one last try. Please bear with me. In the meantime, let me thank the editors of the special issue and the organizers of the conferences for this opportunity to present my work. And I should say this work is very much collaborative. Still no luck?
Joseph, do you know anything about the screen sharing? Would it have to do with the link?
I've never had this problem before.
I'm not sure. Perhaps as a backup, can you send your presentation to one of us and we can try and.
Perfect.
I don't know.
And would it make sense to go to the next keynote as we orchestrate this? I don't want to make us all.
Perhaps we'll try. Let's try that, Kathleen. Tim, are you there?
Yes.
Shall we go to you and then we'll come back to Kathleen? We'll circle back. How does that sound? Good idea, Kathleen.
Hey, apologies.
No worries. No worries at all.
No problem.
So we'll come back to you, Kathleen. So hold the thought. So let's go to Tim Oakes, who's in Colorado at the moment. It's nearly midnight. He'll turn into a pumpkin soon, but we'll try and get him to present before that happens. Thanks for joining us, Tim. For those of you who might know Tim's work, he's one of the leading geographers, I guess, looking at tourism in Asia and Asian concerns in relation to tourism geographies. So Tim is Professor of Geography at the University of Colorado, Boulder. His work focuses on social and cultural transformation in contemporary China, and in particular the uses and reinventions of local culture as a resource for economic development and governance objectives, big issues at the moment. He has held visiting positions in Australia, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands. He's project director for ChinaMade, an international research collective exploring the infrastructural dimensions of China's increasingly global development practices. So I hand over to you now, Tim. This is T1, Tim 1. Over to you, Tim.
I know, it's so very confusing when everyone's named Tim. Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction. Thank you also, Honglu and Mary, for co-editing the special issue. Especially Honglu for your encouragement along the way, and I'm sorry that I've not been able to make it to the first 2 conferences. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in Hanoi in something like 15 months time. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen and see if that works, and hopefully I don't have the same kind of problem. How's that? Okay. All right. So this is what I'm gonna talk a little bit about what I wrote in the commentary, and then I'm going to try to extend a little bit beyond that. But I mean, what I was interested in thinking about in the commentary and in reading all of the articles in the special issue was this question about, you know, what does criticality look like in the Asian century? And in some ways, this is very much along the same lines as what TC has just been talking about. And a lot of what I'm going to say will overlap, but I think also offers some different perspectives on some of the same questions that TC has just been talking about. And I'm particularly interested in this question about criticality, as I write in the commentary, in terms of the geopolitical context of deteriorating U.S.-China relations, and that being kind of this kind of background context for the Asian century. And it's a context that has been accentuated by the border hardening impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Tourists have been bordered and channeled, and the barrier between Asia and the Euro-American West has become a significant one over the past year and a half. And it has, of course, also been accentuated by a number of other key political developments, including the politics of the pandemic origins, the rising prominence of Taiwan in the eyes of the US government, the decay of civil rights and civil society in Hong Kong under the new national security law, the Western condemnation of China's systematic trampling of rights of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, and so on. It's a situation that has driven a proliferation, I think, of bordered thinking as scholars inevitably line themselves up on either side of an increasingly polarized geopolitical divide. Criticality begins to mirror and be profoundly limited by, I think, the issues that define superpower conflicts. Now, this is not to dismiss the legitimacy of critical academic work that lays bare state abuses of human rights, that seeks to hold states accountable for such abuses, and that helps us inhabit the life worlds of marginalized peoples who suffer those abuses. But critical scholars should also be compelled to challenge the dominant frames that channel their work towards predictable outcomes. So in my commentary that I wrote in the special issue, I addressed this question by arguing for a shift away from conventional politics defined along the traditional fault lines of rights, freedoms, democracy, and so on, to one defined more in terms of a politics of knowledge. I wanted to think about what critical tourism scholarship looks like in a world of hybrids. This seemed important because even as the geopolitical context was pointing toward an Asian century of increased separation between a China-dominated Asia and the West, the pandemic was making it clear that we needed to keep thinking about mixture, about agency of the non-human world, about the proliferation of hybrids that Latour, Haraway, and many others have been telling us about for quite some time now. And just one example of this, I've found that many of the academic debates over the origins of COVID-19, for example, quickly devolve into sniping over identity politics, where, were Chinese cultural practices of eating wild animals responsible? Was it essentialist and colonial to ask such a question in the first place? But it seemed that the issue called precisely for a move away from a human-centered conception of the political. Sarah Watmore noted some time ago the need for this kind of a move when she called for a shift from a politics of identity to a politics of knowledge, focusing on the conflicts over how we come to understand our place within and connections to the broader ecosystems that we inhabit. And more importantly, how we understand the social and the human to be much less self-contained than we previously thought. COVID-19 has been called the paradigmatic example of an Anthropocene disease. And so it seems that a critical reckoning with the various intersections between tourism and the Anthropocene seems like a good place to start thinking about these issues. So the infrastructural transformations of the world, transformations that tourism thrives on, have been key agents of hybridization. Infrastructures drive ecosystem disturbance, producing conditions of mixture of different human and non-human agents. Indeed, it's productive to think about infrastructures as agents of nature's society entwinement. Tourist spaces, then it follows, can be thought of as disturbed ecosystems of various types, sites of what Latour called nature's cultures, where human and non-human hybrids are under continuous construction in an environment of non-equilibrium. The point here is to move tourism away from a merely social sphere of critical inquiry. Tourism was never merely a human activity, in other words. It has always created disturbed ecosystems that enroll non-human actors in precarious and unpredictable ways. And that's those points there then that I've kind of highlighted in that bullet PowerPoint fashion are, I guess, you know, the kind of the key points that I've trying to make in the written commentary. But for the remainder of my comments today, I want to just extend a little bit beyond the published commentary and offer some additional visions or some additional thoughts on what criticality might look like during the Asian century. And this will circle back to some of these ideas, but also move in some other directions. But in order to do that, I want to return to this question or this issue of the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China. I find myself, as I think about that, I find myself thinking less about a situation of antagonism and more about a situation of separation, or at least the prospect of separation. So to what extent is the Asian century being defined by the emergence of two parallel and increasingly disconnected tourism worlds? One could think of these parallel worlds in traditional geopolitical terms, one dominated by China and the other by the US. With the rising influence of China throughout Southeast Asia, for example, and the simultaneous withdrawal of the US from that region, at least under the Trump administration, tourism might also become increasingly channeled into these separate geopolitical worlds. And China has demonstrated an interest in promoting tourism for geostrategic purposes, sending tourists to the South China Sea or Taiwan, or withholding tourists from South Korea, for example. So it's not unreasonable to think about the ways tourism might become bifurcated into two increasingly distinct spheres, China and the West. Perhaps somewhat like Soviet and Eastern Bloc tourism before the fall of the Berlin Wall, though of course that was on a much smaller scale and you know, a very different kind of tourism. But I find it more productive, actually, to think of these parallel worlds in infrastructural terms. Most obviously, perhaps, one can imagine the impact of China emerging as an infrastructural hub of Asian connectivity with new highways and high-speed rail, and the ways this creates a new center of gravity for a China-based tourism world that promises to rival connectivity throughout Europe and North America. But more impactful, I think, are the digital infrastructures that define these parallel worlds. One of these worlds is dominated by Chinese cyberspace, Chinese apps, Chinese social media, Chinese ride-hailing services, by Tencent, by Alibaba, by Chinese smart tourism, in short. The other world is dominated, I guess, by the rest of the global internet, by Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, the unfettered titans of what Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism. These are largely parallel worlds with surprisingly little overlap, and yet they're remarkably similar. In both worlds, tourists serve as vehicles for data capture and harvesting. and tourist spaces become dense platforms of surveillance. So back to my question, what does criticality look like in a new Asian century dominated by these separate yet similar worlds? It seems that the infrastructural scaffolding that supports these parallel worlds calls for a more techno-political approach to tourism studies. Such an approach begins with the obvious recognition that digital technologies, artificial intelligence, facial recognition software, these are never simply neutral intermediaries making more efficient the tourist's engagement with her world. They are, at minimum, technologies of governance, of ordering. In China, they are deployed with specific governance goals in mind, goals that include disciplining the tourist body, even as they ease that body's mobility through tourist space. But more to the point, they are technologies of conversion, extraction, and transfer. They convert tourists and tourist spaces into data. They transfer that data to servers connected to a network built to extract, process, and feed that data, not only back to tourists in the form of travel information and advertisements, but to industry and government actors as well. This is by no means something limited to tourism, of course, though it has been argued that in China, at least, tourism occupies the leading edge of data extraction. China's tourist sites are the most densely connected places in China in terms of broadband, the most densely saturated with Wi-Fi, and arguably the most surveilled. Now, it's tempting here to define a realm of criticality that focuses on the powers of the state and of digital capitalism. In these terms, a critical tourism scholarship would address how tourists and tourist spaces participate in the extraction of data, how that data is turned into value, how it fuels unfettered state power and capitalist exploitation. And tourists are typically the most enthusiastic promoters of their own exploitation by surveillance capitalism, making the need for critical tourism studies in this area perhaps even greater. In a growing number of Chinese tourist sites, digital tourism services provided by Tencent, Meituan, and Ctrip are completely reshaping the landscape, turning tourist spaces into open-air computers. They used to be open-air museums. Tourism service providers in spaces like Lijiang, for example, are reduced to a sort of digital lumpen proletariat chained to the whims of the digital prostheses that extends out of their smartphones. But a technical political approach should also draw our attention to, or at least open us to understand, the ways these technologies spur unexpected political effects, the ways they can turn certain mundane activities into unintentional political practices. That is, we should be open to a much broader framing of the political when we begin to consider the infrastructural dimensions of tourist practice and tourist space. So what kinds of political spaces have tourist places enhanced by digital infrastructures become? What kinds of political space is the old town of Lijiang, now that access is managed through a digital gateway that entails facial recognition and smartphone monitoring? This, of course, returns us to my previous point about tourism being a more than human activity. In this case, the digital prosthesis of the smartphone, the QR code, the face scanner, these create hybrid cyborg tourists. They turn the tourist space into a machine, and the humans are just one component of that machine. Interestingly, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated this process of hybridization. Tourists have embraced enhanced levels of technological intervention and surveillance in the name of public health and safety. The smart tourist site is increasingly thought of in terms of a safe tourist site, with safety defined in multiple ways. So what are the political implications of these kinds of mixtures? What kinds of questions might a critical tourism studies ask to better understand the ways the political is itself being recast in these hybrid environments, these disturbed ecosystems. So just to kind of wrap these thoughts up, it seems particularly important to ask these questions within the Chinese tourism world, even though I kind of began with the proposition that we have a kind of these separate parallel worlds going on. Most of my comments and most of my thoughts have really been focusing on the Asian side or the Chinese side of those parallel worlds. And it seems particularly important to ask those questions of that world. Chinese tourists are among the most digitally mediated in the world. They are also among the least likely to see themselves as entering a political space when they pass through the facial recognition scanners in order to enter the old town of Lijiang. But the broader point is that this approach encourages us to think about how fixed political positions get muddled up. That is, what the Anthropocene, I think, going back to a kind of a planetary scale, that's what the Anthropocene has really done as much as anything else, of course, with climate change and everything else, but it's also really caused us to rethink standard categories and the kind of standard framing of what the political entails. And so just to kind of conclude that thought, it seems that part of our job as critical tourism scholars then is to sort it out on the more intimate scales of the tourist body, of the tourist site, and of the everyday tourist experience. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Thank you for sharing those very insightful observations from your own work. I know a lot of us as critical tourism studies scholars reference China in a lot of things we do. So all of those thoughts that you've shared with us will become quite useful for us in our own deliberations. So thank you once again, Tim. A silent clap for you. I'm sure everyone's clapping. And we'll get back to, if anyone has any questions for Tim, please share your questions in the chat screen and we will try to get to that later on. So our next keynote, Professor Kathleen Adams, take 2, we'll try this. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. Kathleen will request remote access from me and then we'll take it from there. So fingers crossed, please bear with us for now, 1 second. So I'm sharing my screen, which is Kathleen's presentation. I assume that you're all seeing the presentation now. Yes, good. Now, Kathleen, you will have to request access from a remote control access from me. Can you do that?
If you give me directions, since I haven't done this before.
It says, it should say Joseph Chia is sharing his screen.
There you are. Yes,
yeah.
View options. Okay. Request remote control access. There it is. I think we're good.
Okay. You have remote control access now.
And if you can just, there we go. Perfect. Okay.
Yahoo! Okay, over to you, Kathleen.
All right, victory. Thank you for your patience with these technological glitches, and thank you, organizers and editors of this special issue and the conferences. It's really a pleasure to be here in this mini reunion with all of you. I want to say before starting that this is very much a collaborative effort, and I'm not sure why, but the screen is not changing. Okay, is there a way to put it on the standard screen view?
Go to the bottom left and click on the monitor icon.
Oh, okay.
Bottom left of the screen, can you see that? Bottom left of the PowerPoint screen.
I'm used to going up here.
So if you go to the bottom left, you will see 3 icons there. Click on that one.
Okay, I see. There we go. Okay, back to, I want to credit my co-authors who are Mary Mustanaphan-Azad, who also is the key architect of this PowerPoint. Also Jae-Yun Choi O'Regan from Swansea University, and Gyang Phi from Doi Tan University. All three of us worked collectively on this. The genesis of this talk and the article in the special issue and our project is really an online tea time chat that was set up by Jae-Yun last spring, summer, as the pandemic was just starting out. And all of us were feeling a little bit of a need to shift away from the then dominant focus, which really entailed autopsying COVID-19's devastating impacts. And instead, we kind of hoped to spotlight potential or inspiring practices that were surfacing during the pandemic. And as we pursued our work, we ultimately addressed how COVID-19 pandemic's effects on tourism have amplified for ongoing tourism resiliency trends in Southeast Asia. These include livelihood diversification, ecosystem regeneration, cultural revitalization, and domestic tourism. Rather than simply sudden transformative effects of the pandemic, practices of resilience in tourism reflect ongoing political, economic, and cultural shifts that have often been underway in the region for several decades. That is, we argue that resiliency is cultural as much as it is economic. These cultural shifts will be critical to the reshaping of the post-pandemic tourism industry in the region. So after briefly contextualizing the COVID-19 pandemic in Southeast Asia, which I'm sure almost all of you are aware of, I'll describe these 4 regional trends that we identified and their cultural and economic context. And then I'll conclude with several policy implications and hints of suggestions for future research addressing the intersections of Southeast Asian tourism, COVID-19, and socioeconomic change. Home to some of the world's most popular tourism destinations, Southeast Asia drew 129 million arrivals in 2018. By early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic slowed tourism to a trickle, posing great challenges for those whose livelihoods depend on the industry. While in 2019, the industry's 4.6% annual growth rate outpaced the global average, today, restricted movement, quarantines, and generalized travel anxiety have paralyzed the industry. Scholars have documented some of the specific health and community impacts of COVID-19 in the region. And as we know, many writers have addressed the potential for COVID-19 to reset tourism for a more sustainable future. Yet in Southeast Asia, there is still much to be learned by attending to how place-based trends influence post-pandemic tourism. We should remember that Southeast Asia is no stranger to disasters. In the past 2 decades alone, it was affected by several epidemics, such as the 2002 through 4 SARS outbreak, the avian influenza in 2014 through 15, and various other natural disasters, such as the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, recent eruptions of Gunung Agung on Bali, and so forth. But the COVID-19 pandemic has been an unprecedented crisis for the region's tourism industry, with an estimated loss of US $34.6 billion in 2020 alone. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic situation is rapidly changing with the arrival of the Delta variant. These are the latest numbers downloaded today. As you can see, there are a lot of differences between countries, but there are still, nevertheless, notable trends in tourism industry adaptation and resilience strategies. Our findings highlight the relationship between historically rooted cultural trends in Southeast Asia and tourism resilience and recovery practices. So I'll begin by describing our findings with a description of the role of livelihood diversification and resilience. Ellis identifies livelihood diversification as the process by which rural families construct a diverse portfolio of activities and social support capabilities in order to survive and to improve their standards of living. For many rural communities in Southeast Asia, tourism is a key activity in this portfolio. Tourism encourages the creation of diverse intersectoral linkages, such as agriculture and artisan production, to enhance the value of other economic activities. In Southeast Asia, individuals and communities with histories of diversified livelihood strategies demonstrate significant resilience in a range of important ways. People across the region are tapping into alternative income streams such as cattle rearing and weaving. This is only possible because many tourism workers have never been entirely dependent on tourism, or they were able to reorient tourism-honed skills to non-tourist markets. In the cultural tourism destination of Toraja, Indonesia, where my research has been based, souvenir makers faced with the COVID-19 induced evaporation of tourists have shifted to crafting goods for local markets. For example, many carvers have returned to an adaptive strategy initiated in the early 2000s when political instability and various viruses also prompted dramatic decreases in tourism. These carvers who previously earned livelihoods sculpting souvenirs and weaving are now crafting new genre carvings carved with Toraja designs. These are coffins that they're carving for local people, not for outsiders. Likewise, weavers and painters who once sold their products to tourists are now producing protective masks, as you see here, embellished with Toraja designs to sell primarily to other Torajans. Significantly, some of these livelihood diversification strategies entail new non-face-to-face approaches to business practices. Many rural communities have embraced e-commerce to sell local products to others residing locally, as well as cyber tourists in distant countries. For instance, many struggling tourism entrepreneurs now make use of Airbnb Southeast Asia's online virtual experiences platforms. Among other things, virtual tourists can explore the trail of crazy rich Asians in Singapore or undergo a spiritual awakening via Balinese blessing ritual. There are all sorts of experiences. I'm sure many of you have seen them and perhaps partaken of them online. Likewise, the Singapore-based tour operator Monster Day Tours shifted its focus to virtual gaming tours for Singaporeans and foreigners, although they've now started, as I hear, doing regular tours again. In Singapore and elsewhere, online and virtual experiences are partially orchestrated and funded by government and tourism authorities. Online experiences are also used by social entrepreneurs and social enterprises, I should say, to support their missions. For instance, the social enterprise Friends of Bali uses tourism revenue to subsidize local charities and now offers online Balinese experiences such as cooking classes, donating US $2 for each purchase locally to support the resilience of Balinese communities. Thus, what our research demonstrates is that in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, diverse economic practices have contributed to resilience amongst former tourism actors. This includes many established yet largely overlooked practices that in pre-pandemic times formed part of the array of economies of the region. These practices highlight a diversity of income creation beyond the capitalist industrialized structures of direct tourism-based employment. They also call attention to the robust community development networks that have operated for several decades in most areas of the region. In times of crisis, these organizations have served as an important buoy in an otherwise turbulent sea. I shift now to discuss the role of historical context and cultural shifts that are triggered by the pandemic in tourism resilience. Economic regeneration. Many have widely noted how the pandemic-driven pause in tourism has provided opportunities for ecosystems to recuperate from decades of uninterrupted tourist flows. For instance, unhindered by tourist boats, marine ecosystems are flourishing in Phuket, Thailand. Today, rarely seen species of sharks, dolphins, and whales are now spotted with increasing frequency. In many places, the pandemic catalyzed political support for new policies that reduce over-tourism and its ecological impacts. Yet, in numerous countries, this support was already growing for decades, as our work documents. In Buddhist regions of Southeast Asia, Religious philosophy reminds populations of the value of living mindfully in alignment with nature and developing compassion for human and non-human beings. Similarly, in predominantly Hindu Bali, efforts are underway to reimagine tourism, not as an industrial production line, but a living network system embedded in and subject to nature's operating rules and principles, as Pollack notes and Joseph Cheer's work has shown us. In the Philippines, the pandemic has hit the reset button for Palawan residents, impacting thousands of families who have shifted from fishing and farming to the tourism sector. Yet revenue losses amongst boat operators who once carried tourists to the island's UNESCO World Heritage Sites have forced many to return to other resource depleting income generating activities. Similarly, the Wildlife Conservation Society's regional director in Cambodia observed that tourism's demise has also further threatened Cambodia's endangered giant ibis, which are now marketed in the informal economy. These controversial impacts of COVID-19 on Southeast Asian ecosystems reflect both the ecological limits of growth-oriented tourism and the risks of tourism-financed conservation. Moving from conventional support for trickle-down environmentalism, where conservation follows income generation, the political economy of tourism paradigm demonstrates local communities' tacit knowledge of traditional livelihoods, enabling them to live symbiotically with the ecosystem. For instance, Don, the founding director of a consultancy that supports community-based tourism projects in Vietnam, explains, quote, policies for environmental protection exist to protect the ecosystem, but you really must, if you want to do this, you really must support local poverty alleviation efforts through utilizing tourism as a diversifying livelihood strategy. Locals should not be turned into full-time tourism workers, but be able to continue their traditional livelihood and participate through value-added tourism activities, unquote. Such examples illustrate how pandemic-triggered ecosystem regeneration exists within a much broader historical and place-based or cultural context of livelihood diversification. Further, they also reveal how many communities have long practiced a range of indigenous environmental conservation strategies that are now being reprioritized in the face of the current pause on tourism flows. I turn next to cultural revitalization, which is on the rise in some parts of Southeast Asia. In many cases, cultural revitalization was spearheaded by tourism employees who returned to their rural homelands. In others, creative grassroots initiatives have, at least temporarily, replaced cultural tourism enterprises. Here, I highlight three dynamics pertaining to cultural revitalization in the COVID-19 era. First, throughout the region, cultural revitalization goes hand in hand with domestic cultural tourism and is often prompted by direct government interventions. In Myanmar, prior to the recent coup, tourism practitioners were working on the first phase of the COVID-19 tourism relief plan, which was strongly focused on reopening the country's pagodas and cultural sites for domestic tourists. Western tourists often viewed these sites as, quote, attractions, yet domestic tourists tend to view these as pilgrimage destinations and sites for reconnecting with their heritage. These contrasting visions underscore the continuation and revitalization of historic socio-spiritual mobility patterns. Second, the pandemic has reversed historical trends of rural to urban migration. Tourism business closures prompted thousands of tourist migrant workers to return to their ancestral farms and fishing villages. Together with this reverse migration, we observe a notable revitalization of cultural practices, particularly those related to subsistence activities. For instance, in Indonesia's Toraja Highlands, former tourism sector's workers now grow and harvest traditional foods on ancestral plots and also post photos of themselves on social media, learning to paint and batik Toraja scenes and symbols in their leisure time. Southeast Asian countries are famously ethnically diverse with a myriad of languages and cultures. However, most ethnic minority groups with homelands in remote areas have long experienced cultural domination and been targets for cultural assimilation. Thus, this reverse migration pattern is particularly important in the Southeast Asian context because it facilitates new pathways for revitalizing minority ethnic cultures. Third, many grassroots cultural revitalization initiatives have emerged, albeit with contemporary twists. For example, in Malaysia, a theater group that enjoyed past support from the Ministry of Tourism, Arts, and Culture is now producing online traditional shadow puppet performances to warn Malaysians about COVID-19. We found many similar examples that reveal the potential for local cultural revitalization through new practices that challenge centralized planning norms and defy neoliberal corporate models. As in the prior area of colonialism, contemporary tourism continues to see both national and ethnic minority cultures negotiated and commodified by powerful actors, ranging from transnational corporations and the media to state-directed policies. As such, these sprouting grassroots cultural initiatives can be seen as part of a history of local efforts to reclaim and protect cultural identities and lifeways. Such efforts by minority cultures to re-articulate and reframe touristic representations of their cultural identities began well before COVID-19. Yet the pandemic has provided a new pathway for these efforts. I'll now move on to discuss our final theme, domestic tourism development. Today, faced with the pandemic, many Southeast Asian governments have refocused their efforts on growing domestic tourism. France, for instance, the Singapore Tourism Board invested 45 million Singaporean dollars to encourage residents to take local holidays through the Singapoliday campaign. Other nations in Southeast Asia have pursued similar strategies. Funds such as these subsidize accommodations, transport, food, and attraction to support tourist hotspots, domestic tourist hotspots specifically. Domestic tourism has long been envisioned as both an antidote to dependence on foreign tourists and a nation-building strategy. Indonesia's focus on domestic tourism dates back to the 1970s, when President Suharto promoted it as an avenue for promoting citizens' love of country. Yet critics arose, and almost always the exclusive focus on tourism was on foreigners as the lifeblood of places like Bali's economic vitality. James Guild recently critiqued news reports bemoaning COVID-19's potentially devastating impact on Bali as foreign tourists vanished. Guild notes that this idea that Bali will die without tourists comes uncomfortably close to a white savior narrative, implying that local people have no choice but to hunker down and endure this crisis until foreigners start showing up again to rescue them, unquote. As he argues, this framing strips Indonesians of their agency in rising to meet this challenge, something they are quite capable of doing and have done many times before, unquote. Indeed, previous studies have shown that during the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, domestic tourists in Southeast Asia grew faster than in North America and Europe. This reflects the broader growth in leisure mobility due to the region's expanding middle class. While domestic online platforms existed in pre-pandemic Southeast Asia, today this is accelerated along with the ever-growing interest in domestic tourism. Thus, while domestic tourism has a long history in Southeast Asia, dating back at least to the 1970s, the pandemic has prompted some Southeast Asian governments to refocus their efforts on growing this sector as an antidote to the lost revenues from international tourism. I now turn to some of the policy implications. Significantly, the 4 trends we outlined reveal how the seemingly novel resilience responses to COVID-19 are historically rooted and place-based. By historically rooted, I mean that there is historical precedent to these trends. And by place-based, I mean that they are particular to the cultural, political, and environmental contexts in which they were developed. By attending to the nuances of how resilience to the pandemic is enacted and experienced, we can develop more appropriate and effective post-disaster tourism recovery plans in Southeast Asia. For example, while tourism is often prescribed as a panacea for local or regional development and poverty alleviation, local communities often face challenges integrating tourism markets and depend on maintaining diversified livelihood practices. The rise of social entrepreneurship in the region may offer opportunities to strengthen links with organizations that have long supported local livelihoods. When further supported by government policies, these types of initiatives can help foster an emerging generation of tourism social entrepreneurs. Frameworks for these policies can be drawn from emergency literature on inclusive tourism, which focuses on supporting economic and social inclusions of marginalized populations. This support could be shared through practices such as improving access to tourism production. By facilitating self-representation, traditionally marginalized residents can challenge dominant power relations. The replacement of voluntary measures with governmental environmental policies that mitigate over-tourism can dramatically improve the region's ecosystems, as Joseph Cheer has pointed out. Similarly, these policies should limit reliance on tourism as a key source to fund environmental conservation. Finally, in the post-pandemic period, many destinations would benefit from developing domestic tourism to enhance community resilience in the face of future disasters and border closures. And I won't go on about this because I really would like to conclude by talking about some future directions that we might pursue. And I'll just say that some of the future generations, some of the future directions that we should pursue need to be rooted in considering local histories and local cultural backgrounds and relationships. In a region that just a year ago welcomed 487 million international arrivals, the COVID-19 pandemic has unquestionably triggered catastrophic impacts for millions of residents. In our communications with tourism practitioners, many described being laid off, filing bankruptcy, and ongoing economic crisis. Yet we caution that by focusing exclusively on clinically chronicling the COVID-19 era's economic violence to the tourism sector, we may end up obscuring the numerous examples of agency also present. In this vein, alongside tragedy, we've highlighted examples of resilience in the Asian Pacific region and argued that understanding of the implications of COVID-19 on tourism, lives, and livelihoods requires a place-based account of local cultural experiences and context. Finally, some suggestions for future research on COVID-19's implications for an increasingly precarious tourism sector. You'll find more in our article. First, scholars should consider how COVID-19 prompted urban to rural migration and how this migration contributes to the revitalization of cultural practices and reshapes rural demographics. Second, scholars may also investigate creative initiatives undertaken by those returned migrants whose prior involvements in tourism leads them to new products with regional, national, and global market appeal. Finally, scholars may also investigate how former tourism sector workers who return to rural homelands may carry tourism knowledge as well as local knowledge that can foster successful new domestic tourism ventures in rural areas. And I think this is something important to explore. Additionally, future research on COVID-19 would benefit from diversification of scholarship and literature beyond the Western-centered interpretations and methods. In the midst and aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, this will provide more culturally relevant tourism knowledges and practices for Southeast Asia in what is now widely dubbed the Asian Pacific Century. And thank you from all four authors.
Thank you, Kathleen. Very well done. Can you stop sharing the screen now so that we can, so click stop. I'll stop sharing the screen now, There we are.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that. It was perfectly positioned between after Tim and TC's session. So it all worked out nicely. So Without further ado, let's go to Q&A. There have been a few questions come through on the chat screen, and Hung Lu will be the Q&A moderator. So over to you, Hung Lu.
Okay, so we are a little bit short on time, but then quite a few good questions there. So maybe I will just start off with Phoebe's question, who was actually targeting directed to TC. I think that actually all three keynotes can potentially chime in. And Phoebe was asking, TC and now the other Caitlin and Tim as well. What do you think are some of the most critical insights Asian scholars can bring to critical tourism, even if we don't define these insights as being critical? Are there any top of your mind authors or scholars that you would like to point us out towards?
Probably not authors, but I was just thinking, what is unique to Asia? So unique to Asia, born in Asia kind of phenomena. That would be where deep critical insights come from. So immediately I was thinking of things like real estate and tourism. The sort of real estate boom in China, for example, and how it is fueled by tourism, and very often domestic tourism. So northern Chinese having second homes in the southern cities and the coast and Sanya and so forth. So that form of tourism is quite unique. Well, particularly unique to China with its real estate sort of boom. But when I think of that sort of infrastructure, that's exactly what Tim had also said: transport infrastructure, digital technologies, and digital infrastructure. So things which are unique, born in Asia, and Asians therefore, or in this case Chinese, can therefore immediately value add through unique insights. So that is what I feel would be important. Starts in Asia, what is unique in Asia, what is born in Asia, and let's have insights from Asia on those areas. Thanks.
Would Caitlin and Tim like to also chime in on this part?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I was just thinking about how, work that I have done in Guizhou over the years, which has involved, a lot of collaboration with local scholars at, a very, very local, local teachers' colleges in local towns. And that collaboration has always been really interesting to me because they have close connections. So this is when I was doing a lot of work on rural villages and village tourism, and a lot of these local scholars who wouldn't think of themselves as critical scholars and wouldn't even think of themselves as tourism studies scholars, who are kind of like advocates for a lot of the villagers in their areas, because nobody else is really kind of in a position to advocate for those people. And they're just doing that because they're interested in those places, they're interested in those cultures, and they're interested in telling other people what's going on with the changes and those kinds of things. And, we would have these conversations and they would be engaged in really critical work, but, not really thinking of it in those terms, but just because of their intimate knowledge and connection with those places. And it seemed like one of our roles as more kind of globally connected scholars would be to amplify those voices and bring them more into conversation with those of us who think of ourselves as more formally as tourism studies scholars.
Caitlin, did you have something to share about this as well? Or?
I would echo what Tim just said. I see exactly the same thing in collaborations with Indonesian scholars and local elders as well, who in my vocabulary, I would call critical thinkers about tourism, but they would not put that label on themselves, I don't think. Yet what they're doing is making critical interventions and advocating in various ways for those who are underrepresented and amplifying voices.
Yep. Okay, so thank you for that. I think that we have probably more questions than we can answer. So I'm just going to go chronologically according to who asked them first. So Regina actually asked this question to Caitlin about how, governments in Asia have often played a strong role in supporting communities, as Caitlin's presentation really talked a lot about. So, and she compares this with what is happening in the Pacific Islands. And so, you know, seeing some of the differences, would you perhaps, Caitlin would like to quickly respond to how, you know, we can understand this, or would Regina like to chime in a little bit here?
I can say something.
Okay.
Where I work in Indonesia, the decentralization over the past decade and a half or so has really played a role in shifting initiatives to local levels, to local regencies and local kecamatan even. And that has, again, it's a process that's been ongoing, and yet that has enabled a lot of local initiatives for speaking to how tourism might unfurl in those communities. Now, admittedly, there's always a caveat, right? Local communities are equally hierarchical, and certain voices, certain individuals get to the table in decision-making more readily than others. So I don't want to sound too Pollyanna-ish, but there are these, conditions, and one of them is decentralization that has enabled a little bit more possibility for minority groups to speak to how they want things to develop. I think some of my other co-authors might want to answer this question as well. I feel like I'm the face of the article, but it's really a collaborative effort. So I know Mary is here. I'm not sure if the others are.
Jian is here as well, right? Regina, was there something you would like to add to this?
I know you have other questions. I just wanted to say thanks, Kathleen. It just seemed that there were in a few of your examples that you guys had pulled together, the government seemed to be playing quite a proactive role in supporting that transition to different forms of tourism or other activities that were helping people with their livelihoods. And that was really cool to see. We haven't seen as much of that in the Pacific, but it gave me some ideas about policy shifts and so forth that could be supportive. But I thought maybe that was to do also with that governments, in some Asian countries have been more interventionist in a way, but in the past, in development generally, that's a really positive thing in some of these cases you've given. So thanks very much for the examples, and I'll let you bring in some other questions. There's some great ones out there. Yeah. Thanks.
So the next question I actually see is from Yinn. Yinn, like Regina, is also one of our panelists. So maybe Yinn, would you like to pose the question yourself?
Sure, thanks so much, Hong-Lu. So my question is for TC, and it's fairly similar to Phoebe's question, but I guess I'm shifting from people to terms and theories. So I found your mention of Vietnamese kitsch really interesting, because kitsch only entered English from Yiddish some decades ago, yet you pose it as an English word. And of course, many words that we take for granted in Chinese now, 经济, economy, or even self, 自我, these terms are also products of late 19th century, early 20th century colonial encounter and hybridization. So much of this is, we could call a very long historical process, and one of encounter with all of the political entanglements so entailed. So given your focus on articulations and accessibility for Asian critical scholarship, Asian critical tourism studies scholarship, I'm curious, what, if any, terms and theories, in addition to people and access, of course, but terms and theories you see coming back into Anglophone scholarship or hybridizing in new ways in this ongoing translingual encounter? Thanks.
Yeah, I think obviously this is something that everybody in our Zoom room will be able to contribute from your part of the world, right? But I'm a tourism geographer, I'm also an urban geographer. I recall in the 90s, or is it 80s, this term, desa kota. Desa kota is a coming together of two Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Malaya terms together to describe a peri-urban sort of phenomenon, which a urban geographer found in peculiar to Southeast Asia. So maybe Indonesia, maybe Malaysia, but all part of the world, Southeast Asia. And the only way to express it, he said, was bringing together two Bahasa terms to create a non-English word, calling it desa kota. However, I don't think it really caught on. Perhaps people mention it because it's novel, but it's those sorts of terms, like coming from the ground, expressing a phenomenon which is just unique to a particular part of the world. Of course, the geographer is a Canadian geographer, Terry McGee. Great, we need people to come in and then, you know, in this case, hybridize terms. But I suppose my point is, why can't those of us who are here, right here, in the midst of phenomena, come up with terms that hopefully will circulate? So thank you so much for this, letting us know that Kitsch actually came from elsewhere. I mean, how interesting that terms, you know, circulate to a point that now they become, well, nobody knows its origin, but that it just shows how tyrannical some words can become. Thank you so much, Yinn.
So thank you for answering that as well. The next question actually is by Jasmine, who is also a panelist. So I'll invite her to pose a question to Tim. Jasmine?
I'm
Yes,
not allowed to turn on my video, but that's okay. I can just speak. Thanks, everyone. And it was a bit as a follow-up from Ian's question. So I'm also interested in these flows and exchanges. And yeah, I wonder how that more nuanced understanding on identity politics and politics of knowledge may help us, or more people who may not necessarily identify themselves as critical tourism scholars to, you know, pay more attention to places that have been in between the East and West. So, so how do we go beyond this discussion of colonialism or decolonialism or post-colonialism to go maybe one layer deeper? That's between this, you know, the relations between human and human non-human. So just curious what you think about that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's Jasmine, it's a great question. I mean, it's, you know, there's a lot to say. I mean, I guess I would start just, you know, one of the things I was trying to advocate, I guess, was not just a more nuanced view of identity politics, but actually moving away from identity politics towards other frames of the political, or other ways of thinking about the political. And yeah, I mean, I really like where the question is going in terms of thinking about you know, hybridity and in-betweenness in you know, larger senses of those terms, not just in terms of the human, non-human, but in many other dimensions. I mean, you know, almost all places are hybrids of some sort, and most tourism sites in Asia, particularly, it seems like, are, and recognizing that and making that the kind of the starting point of any discussion, I think is a good place to start. Yeah, I've been thinking about this in the context of Hong Kong, of course, where I've spent more time than a lot of other places, I guess, recently. But you know, it's those political issues around colonialism, around occupation, around these kinds of things have become so pronounced now that it does seem that raising questions about mixture and making that the starting point would be a good direction to move in. But I think it needs to be emphasized, and I'll just stop with this, but I think it really needs to emphasize that in between East and West, I think is also a problematic starting point, because it kind of assumes that binary in the first place. And I think there's so many different levels and so many different kinds of in-betweenness. There's in-betweenness within different Asian societies. There's in-betweennesses at different scales and different local levels. And I don't think we want to get too focused on an East-West binary and thinking about the in-betweenness between those, because everything is in between something. And I think if we can start with that, that's also a good starting place. No, thanks for that question. It's great.
So I think thank you for answering that as well. And in fact, you know, being like ethnic Chinese in Singapore, you know, we are in fact in between all these things as well, you know. So I think many of us listening in, you know, feel this sort of issues that are very real to even our personal lives beyond our research lives, right? So I do know that there's two other questions, one by Chinny and one by Ken Seng, but then we are kind of running short on time. We have overrun a little bit on this section. Anyway, we're all friends. So I believe, you know, Chinny can discuss with Tim and then Ken Seng with Caitlin as well off this this session. This session is really just a sort of spark for us, you know, to begin some of these conversations. So with that, I think we thank our three keynotes as well as all of the participants for your questions and giving us a lot of insight and how to move forward, which especially in a time which, you know, in a pandemic, so much have changed and, you know, sort of reset the stage for how we think critical tourism should be in the future. So I think there's a lot of work for all of us to do from this point onwards. And I'll pass the mic back to Joseph to run the next section, which is the Authors Roundtable. You're muted, Joseph.
Thank you. That's the Zoom term of the century. You're muted. Turn your mic on. I just wanted to say thank you to Tim and Kathleen and TC. I know for Tim and Kathleen it's well after midnight, and you haven't turned into pumpkins yet, so that's great. Thank you for sticking around, and for others as well. I know some of you may have to dash off to classes and other things, so if you need to depart, please do so. We appreciate your attendance. So now let's go over to the authors. The authors have been sticking around for the last hour and a bit, so thank you for doing that. And very rarely do we ever get to see the names behind the papers that are written. So this is a very good opportunity for us to do that. If I can, I'll just quickly go through the list of papers and who's here. So if you're here, wave your arms around so people know who you are. So the first paper is Chris Gibson. Chris is not here. He sent us a video, which we might package in at the end or with the post-webinar emails because of time. Kathleen wrote one of the opening papers. Hazel Tucker's here as well. Hi, Hazel. Thanks for joining us from Otago. I don't think Stuart will be joining us from Sweden. TC Chang is here from Singapore. Please read his paper if you had any questions. This one in Tourism Geographies and the recent one in Annals of Tourism Research. Claudio Minca is here from Italy, from Bologna. Hi, Claudio. He's probably had about 6 espressos already. Maartje is here from Barcelona. Hi, Maartje. Thanks for joining us. Yinn Shan's here from Singapore. Thanks, Yinn Shan. Regina's here from New Zealand, and Gabriel, who was in New Zealand when the paper was written, is now in Germany. So thanks for joining us, Gabriel. It's early in the morning. Nicole and Ken Seng. Ken Seng's here, but I don't think Nicole is here. Hi, Ken Seng. I know you have to run quickly, so we'll go to you first. Nicholas Progano is here, and Kumikato with the paper on pilgrimage in Japan. Mary, Jasmine Chang is here from Sweden. We can't see her, but she's definitely here. I don't think Carol is joining us. Ian is here. Thanks for joining us, Ian. Kathleen, Jayon, Mary, and Young Tifi had written one of the last papers. So thank you all. Now let's go to Q&A for authors, and I will hand over to Hung Lu to first grill Ken Seng about his paper before he disappears.
Okay, I'm not supposed to be grilling Ken Seng. I'm supposed to be very respectfully asking Ken Seng. So, you know, since the paper has been published a while back, and of course, you know, with COVID, with all these international border restrictions and all these new policies and restrictions being put in place, you know, are there kind of other ways or means of understanding what you have already written, or, you know, things which, you know, since time has passed, you would like to add on to your paper as well? How should we read your paper with a little bit of a hindsight?
Well, thank you very much, Hung Lu, and thank you for asking the questions respectfully. That's very unusual of you. Well, that's not true. She has always been very nice towards me. And thank you to the keynote speakers. I mean, what a pleasure that we have. I mean, if there's any good thing that comes out of the pandemic, I can't think of any, but one of the things is that we are able to meet here and to listen to those presentations. Hung Lu, as you mentioned, that the paper was written quite a while ago, and in the context, the paper is on food safety. We provide a history of food safety in Singapore and how and where we are today, where Singapore basically is a very, very safe place where you can actually have street food or the so-called street food. And we basically situated the whole process from the pre-colonial times to the colonial period, to the PAP period, where we have the government now, where how things have become modernized and become sanitized and clean. I think we can just draw the trajectory in the same way as in Singapore has managed the pandemic extremely well, although there are more than 800 cases in Singapore today, but it's under control. And despite whatever we may actually say, my colleague and I, Nikki and I mean, we were talking about Singapore as a colonial place, and continuously, I mean, those of us who are from Singapore still use the English language, and we have adopted the British legal system. And despite all these criticisms, there were actually a lot of good things that came out of it, that we survived. You don't really fall sick in Singapore when in those along the streets. So the social engineering, the indoctrination, which we like to criticize very much, has actually allowed for the country to prosper, and also to create a tourism industry that is that's admired all over the world. But I think one of the issues that we are concerned about is that in a few articles that I wrote on Singapore is that tourism has come to define not only food cultures in this context, but how it has helped to domesticate the nature in Singapore, as well as defining the art development over there. And so I think that's where the tension will always be. I think it's up to the Singaporeans to actually to negotiate and to relate to a government that is place-based, using Kathleen's term, that is elected by the people, but is adopted from its colonial masters. So there are many contradictions there.
Okay, thanks, Ken Seng. If you'd like to know more about Ken Seng's paper, have a read of it, right? Because when we think of Singapore, at least when I think of Singapore, I think of food. And when I read Ken Seng's paper, I lost some of my appetite, but because, you know, it's about food safety and the Russian roulette that goes on behind the scenes. But nevertheless, let's thank you, Ken Seng. Let's go to the next question. I will pose this to co-authors, Claudio, Minca, and Maartje Roelofsen in Bologna and Barcelona, respectively. Airbnb and the sharing economy loomed large before the pandemic, right? And most of the papers we see were written before then. I wonder, Claudio and Maartje, since your paper, how has the pandemic impacted some of the findings that you raised insofar as Airbnb and the quantified self in tourism is concerned?
Thanks, Maartje. Do you want to start?
No, please go ahead. Otherwise, yeah, no, please go ahead.
Okay. Very quickly, I have a few points about the biopolitics of microspecialities related to the pandemic condition and how it changed in many ways, not only, of course, the environment of Airbnb, but all this kind of micro relationships related to tourism, community, and especially the cultural differences between Europe and Asia. So I'd like to highlight just a few points that have been part of the way in which I was trying to rethink what I reread the paper a few days ago. I said, oh my God, everything is different now. But to some extent it is. So the first point that I wanted to raise is that it is true. There is a deep requalification of our bodies and as tourist subjects, as Team and other speakers highlighted on several occasions this morning, or my morning, and they were being translated into bioprofiling, right? So this kind of bioprofiling of the tourist in relation to leisurely mobility is deeper and deeper. That's one element. But even at the micro scale, there's something very important that has been changing. The first thing is this invisible dimension of the threat that is incorporated by the tourist body. And one of the first things that we notice is that on the one hand, in theory, the migrant body and the tourist body are equally dangerous, are equally potentially dangerous. But again, there is a different ways in which mobility is treated, despite the fact that the presence or the potential presence of the virus and the threat to contamination could have produced a different result. So this kind of discrimination towards different bodies and the possibility of mobilities, in many ways, has been taking different forms in a post-pandemic environment. And the other thing I want to say is that in Europe, looking at Europe in particular, there was a big push in order to facilitate tourism, and there's a clear relationship between the increase in the presence of tourists and an increase in the infections, right? So how biopolitically this kind of dimension will be managed in different parts of the world is a big question for me. Going back to the micropolitics of biopolitics, there's another point that I'd like to raise, which is to do with trust. Many encounters related, for example, to the Airbnb environment, or again, the relationship between tourists and local community, are strangely based on a cultural idea of trust. You know, people tend to approach or allow people to approach them, or to interpret the different measures related to the pandemic, depending on the type of body and the type of aspect they find themselves to deal with, right? And again, trust, as we know, is a culturally defined practice, and is based on cultural code. So it'll be really important to see how people behave at a micro scale in an Asian context compared to the European context. I know people who, for example, still tend to hug in Europe, or get too close because they kind of trust the friends and the family members. And to some extent, that applies also to relationship to tourists. The other three quick points I want to raise, I'm not going to develop them, is this idea of self-disciplining that we develop in the paper. How self-disciplining will work in a post-pandemic environment related to Airbnb, and again, that type of short rental context. The self-disciplining for who, and why do you self-discipline? Because there's a strong cultural, dimension in our analysis of the paper, but now self-discipline is also very biological. It's just washing your hands, keeping a distance, and following specific measure. But how does it work in terms of the ways which tourists actually deliberately decide to comply to this rule, especially in the microspaces of Airbnb? The other point is about co-free spaces. We had several experiments where they tried to create co-free islands. So this idea of purification of space is a long-standing idea in tourism, as we all know. It was a complete failure. In theory, they want to create coffee island in different parts of Europe. The cruise ships are also selling their possibility of leisure in a coffee environment. In fact, apparently it doesn't really work. So this this fantasy of purified spaces works in different contexts, right? So in many ways, what I'm trying to say here is that the cultural codes and the practices related to tourism are less and less standardized, and the cultural differences will determine more and more how we react to a post-pandemic or this kind of long wave of pandemic condition for tourism. And the last point that I want to make is about the no-vax politics, all the people who refuse the biopolitics of vaccination, and how that is actually imposing specific relationship with, in Europe, this is happening all the time. People who do not want to be vaccinated, they still want to be tourists. And for people working in the tourist industry, for people working in tourism, this is always a bit of a struggle to understand how to manage hospitality in a highly politicized environment where there are many people who actually refuse to vaccinate. And so there's a whole argument about the biopolitics of vaccination as a sort of a new form of affirmative biopolitics, but I leave it there because, of course, this will require a few years of work, at least for me.
Thank you, Claudio. We look forward to I feel a paper or a book coming on at least, so we look forward to that, and we can say we heard it first here.
Yeah,
okay.
This is just random thinking, but
pressure,
okay.
No pressure. Thank you, Claudio and Maartje. Hung-Lu, did you want to go to the next question?
Does Maartje have something to add as well at this point first? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of interesting developments here since our publication, I think. And of course, first and foremost, the responses on behalf of Airbnb and the consequences, the consequential changes to Airbnb's operations and also digital infrastructure were mostly inspired by health and safety concerns. And I guess these were also really fueled by anxieties related to the exposure to the virus through interactions with the unknown other between hosts and guests in the very private, intimate setting of the home. What we observed recently is that some of these concerns and anxieties on Airbnb's forums, for example, were oftentimes also driven by Orientalist assumptions and also locating, let's say, the origin of the virus in China, but also Asia more broadly. For example, hosts discussing that they would exclude receiving guests coming from this region. But similarly, we also observed some comments that hosts would refuse to implement certain health and safety measures imposed by Airbnb, such as mask wearing in the house, because those measures were actually not compulsory or made compulsory by their governments at that time. And so like in Mary's and Joseph's and Hung-Lu's recent paper on geopolitical anxieties in tourism, I also think that we could observe these anxieties prevailing in the Airbnb economy. And also the operationalization of new health and safety protocols on the platform through data collection, through algorithmic management, and trying to instill specific behavior among hosts and guests. And I think that's something that we're currently working on, and it raises new questions. So that's what I could add.
Thank you, Maartje. And you're in the best place to do it, in Barcelona, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Over to you, Hung-Lu.
So thank you for adding that. I just wanted to share the only leisure tourism we can do from Singapore to leave the country is to go on a cruise. I went on one, and I was told by the cruise people working on a cruise that for 10 months they have not had shore leave, and they have had to do a PCR test once in 3 days. So, I think there's a lot of these biopolitics that's really coming into play here. Sorry for abusing my right as a moderator. Next, actually, we wanted to ask if you observed in the series of papers, we have 2 papers that talk about conference spaces as in like critical tourism studies as well. So both of them address a kind of wave of Chinese scholars, entering a lot of these conference spaces. And we have Yinn and Jasmine. Perhaps maybe 2 of you would like to make your comments, maybe even in relation to each other's papers, if that's something that you're comfortable with. Does Yinn or Jasmine would like to go first? We can't see Jasmine. Oh, Jasmine, would you like to go first?
There was some kind of internet problem, so I had lost what you said. Sorry.
Okay.
And I'm trying to ask you the permission to turn on my camera. But yeah, what did you say? Sorry, Hung-Lu, can you just repeat?
I was just saying that there's 2 papers that are both related to conference spaces, and then perhaps Yinn and Jasmine, you would like to comment on your papers. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Or would Yinn like to go first while Jasmine figures out how to turn on the camera?
Yeah, maybe.
Yinn, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead. So my paper was about the geopolitical instrumentality of tourism studies, and it was based on an ethnography of an international conference about tourism and the Chinese dream, which was held in 2017 in the Gold Coast of Australia. So I argue that if not only tourism is a geopolitical enterprise, so is its scholarship with real material effects. So listening to Tim's keynote, it really spoke to me in the discussion of border thinking in the context of the deterioration of U.S. and China relations and a program against other aspects of Chinese policy, as well as U.S. state abuses too. But of course, it's not just China and the U.S., but China and Australia, for example, which was foregrounded in my contribution, deteriorated at least as much, or at least more dramatically, given how rosy things looked on the surface. I think the conference I attended was probably the moment right as China-Australia state-level relations collapsed, not just state level, but also academic. And of course, Australia has suffered unprecedented fires since then, pandemic-driven university closures, whole-scale shutdowns of Asian studies programs too. I think they all shut down at UWA. And this again got me thinking about Tim's discussion of nature-society hybrids. The conference, as much as I focused on its geopolitical dimensions, was couched in a language of eco-civilization. It featured koalas and pandas on the cover page, speaking of kitsch. This particular case, in some ways seems all too human, even if the hybrid reality that we all share is a threat. And another example of this is the Chinese leadership's recent declaration that they won't discuss climate change with the US unless the US agrees to certain geopolitical claims. This was just in the last couple of weeks. So a lot of these conflicts are playing out not just geopolitically like this, but also, as Tim points out, geoeconomically through digital platforms and the like. And so, and other technologically mediated hybrids. So this just has me thinking about how my paper and the other issues at play here are not just touching on questions of Anthropocene, but also a political economic complement or competing term, the Capitalocene, within and beyond tourism. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks, Yinn. And it was funny to discover that we both have a paper in the special issue about conference, although in rather different angles. And I thought it was really good complementary what we had in our own papers. So, and it was, and I got to read yours before I published mine. So that was really nice. I think I took a very different angle from Yinn's. While I have all this awareness of geopolitics going on in the background, but I was very interested in these individual exchanges. Because it doesn't seem like being discussed before, while we are very interested in how non-Western or Asian academics have become more visible in tourism studies and critical tourism studies. It was sort of like and I have to give credit to my co-author Carol John, who's working in UK. It was from post-critical conference discussion with her that she exposed me to, because I was very much in my own bubble, and she exposed me to other Chinese academics' comments on critical tourism studies. So I became really, or conferences, and I became really intrigued. Therefore, we decided to make this paper. And I think it was very much led to the interviews we did, very much led us to this relational understanding of how one position among these spaces, but also knowledge making. And I think in the post-pandemic and even during the pandemic, there's a lot of new questions to ask, because it's a very different way of mingling and mapping. But I think the place or the placeless of conferences nowadays, so it opens some doors, because some people in the interview said they have to choose because of the funding, or choose places closer or within China due to the funding limitation. And now it's maybe easier, but it's also harder for, I guess, for non-Western scholars to mingle. Although there's various digital platforms that try to imitate the physical space as much as possible, but I wonder, so I'm just curious, as future research question how each of us may be, if we go beyond the fixation on the binaries, how do we make these interactions with each other? And as much as, you know, people start to revalue the role of conferencing in knowledge making, especially during the pandemic. So people start to have I think we all changed our views on conferences very much. So it would be just interesting to look at that whole landscape. Yeah, that's my.
Okay, thank you, Jasmine. It's fair to say that the world has turned upside down in the last 18 months, right? Everything we thought we knew before, we've had to rethink once again. Thank you for joining us, Jasmine from Sweden and Yinn in Singapore. If I can ask the next question to Regina in New Zealand and Gabriel in Germany. The reason they're in different places is when the paper was written, they were in New Zealand together, but now Gabriel's in Germany. So the turn to the local is what your article was about, local food production and the links to tourism and the Sustainable Development Goals. And most of us know that, and there was some discussion before about domestic tourism, which really references the turn to the local. I wonder if you could say something about your paper and how your findings either remain fairly solid or have had you rethink some of your findings. Over to you. Either of you can start.
Okay, Gabriel. I'm going to jump in because then I'm going to pass on to you, Gabriel, to give us an example of why we can't romanticize the possibilities for food, agriculture, tourism linkages. I think in the light of the pandemic and the need for diversification and looking at different ways of resilience building through alternative livelihood approaches and so forth, some of the stuff that Kathleen's shared, there is a lot of discussion around building stronger connections between agriculture and tourism sectors. Once again, we've had these discussions a lot in tourism and they're really important to have. And so Gabriel and I have written this paper on tourism and linkages between tourism, resorts, local food production and the Sustainable Development Goals, and looking at Fiji in particular. And we talk about 3 of the SDGs and where the possibilities should be for building stronger linkages with between the food and the tourism sectors. SDG 2 on ending hunger and achieving food security, SDG 12 on ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns, and SDG 14 on conservation and sustainable use of the oceans and marine resources. So we think there's lots of potential here, but Gabriel did some awesome PhD research in Fiji that opened my eyes to some of the limitations as well to building those strong connections. And part of that was done through an ethnographic approach where he spent a month working as a chef in a hotel kitchen. So that was a really cool approach, methodologically really interesting for those who might like to read a bit about his research. He's published other things, and also his PhD thesis is available via the Massey University Library. So I'd encourage you to look at that. But Gabriel, perhaps over to you about what are you thinking? What maybe share something from the paper, or what are you thinking now about possibilities for these linkages given the pandemic situation?
Yeah, thanks, Regina. One of the things that came to my mind straight away was a finding that I realized that many farmers hesitated to grow food for tourism, because what probably many of you understand is that the people visiting a place are not necessarily the people that also eat what the particular place actually produces. Now, a German visiting Italy will probably eat everything that's grown in Italy. A German visiting Fiji will probably not necessarily want to live off root crops for 2 weeks, right? So there's always a bit of a disconnect of what does the locale have to offer and what does the visiting people would like to eat and can comfortably eat for the entirety of their stay. And in Fiji, I had lots of stories of chefs and people trading with food to say, listen, I found farmers and I was able to convince them to grow, I don't know, cherry tomatoes or basil or, you know, something that the Westerners like to eat. And the farmers, they had a hard time coming around to that idea of growing not something local. But then when they realized that they could sell, I don't know, a kg of basil for a ludicrous amount of money, as one of my participants said, they're starting to smile, meaning they feel the cash coming in. Now that's great, and everyone thought that's, isn't that a beautiful way of connecting tourism to the local agricultural and smallholder landscape? And then one counter argument was always to say, well, that really puts them out of the domestic market, because the locals, when they go shop, they probably don't look for cherry tomatoes and basil. They look for root crops and, you know, whatever the South Pacific Islands have to produce. And now something happened that, you know, none of us would have imagined ever happened, and that is this entire shutdown of tourism, especially in places like Fiji, where domestic tourism is not necessarily a big thing, right? If at all. And suddenly a farmer who was able to participate in tourism through the tourism food chain suddenly was out of a market. And I think that really very much puts, you know, sort of emphasizes our argument that it's not the local economy that, or the local supply chain, in our case, very much in terms of agricultural production and food production, that would need to change in order to fit the tourism purpose. But it's also the tourism product that somehow needs to change to suit local conditions if it is to be sustainable. And I think that, you know, that flip of the script to say it's not the local farmer that has to change, it's perhaps the Hiltons and Hyatts and Marriotts and, sorry, Kathleen, to name all the US American chains here, but you know, many of them are, but there are also some nasty German chains, don't worry. And we have to somehow consider whether building up this usual westernized concept of a large scale 5-star, 350 room, 5 pools, 2 restaurants, blah, 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 tourism concept, whether that is actually what fits most destinations. And I hope that somehow answers the question. But thanks for the question, and thanks, Regina, for the introduction. Yeah, go and cook at a hotel and you will learn. Yeah.
Just one final note on in response to the question then. Thanks, Gabriel. That was fantastic. And it's that lots of people who were waiters, who were working behind reception at resorts, who were doing the gardening, etc., are now back on their communal land growing food, or they're out fishing, and they're doing it both for their families, their wider clans, also for to earn income. And there is a lot more local food production than there was, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this transition back to tourism, which is not happening in most of the Pacific countries that we've done research in yet. The borders aren't open yet, but it'll be very interesting to see, because those people have also said, I'm missing my job at the resort, but you know what? I'm so at peace working in my plantation. It's fantastic. And women saying, it's so great to feed my kids proper food, not just noodles, because I've been working long hours at the resort. And so it's really interesting. It's going to be, yeah, quite a transition. So thanks for the opportunity to be part of this, and lots of appreciation to the keynotes and the other authors. Exciting conceptual ideas being presented.
Thank you, Regina and Gabriel. Over to you, Hung Lu, for the next question.
Yeah, so Hazel's camera is not on. Are you with us, Hazel? Oh, yes. Okay. So, well, we wanted to move next on to Hazel. You know, in your paper, you talked a lot about the kind of educational experiences and almost like serendipities of learning when we bring our students overseas. This is clearly something that is highly curtailed in today's world. So maybe you can share with us what you think, you know, how can we make sense of your paper, and also a little bit more about then moving forward, if this kind of border restrictions, which has been in place for coming to 2 years, continue, you know, how do we as educators address, you know, all these issues?
Okay, thanks, Hung Lu. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I co-authored this paper with Stu Hayes, so I acknowledge Stu here as well. who can't be with us this evening. But yeah, our paper is about how pedagogy, and we particularly sort of talk about the international classroom, and so a mixture of international students, and how that can really open up the possibility for a more open and kind of decentered scholarship. Because if well, we sort of start off from the premise that education is, and the classroom is maybe where the orthodoxy of tourism knowledge, so for example, Western-centric knowledge, where that might become sort of get produced and reproduced, but also the classroom can be a space where that knowledge is disrupted and challenged. And so we talk about, in the paper, we talk particularly about the example of our field school program, where we take students, international students from New Zealand to Thailand, where we took, I should use the past tense here now, from New Zealand to Thailand, a program that Mary was also involved in at the beginning when we set up the program in the beginning. And so, yeah, we spoke about how that particular program and having international students in this space where we're observing and note-taking, discussing and so on in a sort of international tourism context, and how this sort of wonderful kind of opening and decentering of knowledge kind of comes out of that kind of environment and that sort of mingling environment. And so yeah, so we're really kind of talking up, I guess, how the international classroom can decenter knowledge and scholarship, basically. And so obviously that Thailand field school hasn't happened for a couple of years now, and I have no idea when and if it might start up again. It definitely won't happen again next year, and I don't know about 2023. But also, of course, as we all know, the international classroom has sort of had a big curtailment put on it, which is, I mean, I'm finding it devastating, and the particularly, I mean, we are having international students. I'm sure many of us are, and we're trying to teach in a sort of hybrid environment where we've got domestic students who are in New Zealand here in the classroom physically, and we're having international students, mostly from China, zooming into the classroom. But of course, you know, that there's a separation, and the experience isn't the same for the two groups. And so yeah, so I mean, there are ways that I'm kind of getting ideas, as you know, as we've been speaking this evening for me. I've been getting ideas about, you know, maybe we need to, at least in the meantime, start communicating more and getting our groups of students interacting with each other, you know, and getting whole sort of exercises set up where we can get cohorts of students interacting with each other. Obviously that won't quite be the same as the actual international classroom, but yeah, one idea. So let's do that. Let's start talking to each other and getting groups of students together.
Thank you, Hazel. Yeah, in Australia and New Zealand, of course, international students haven't been able to enter the country, right?
Mm.
It's a big hole in university environments. Okay, thank you, Hazel. Our next question goes to Yinn Chen, who's in Singapore. Her article with Hung Lu made the summation that through its reproduction of the happy family identity, going on holidays has become one of the few ways of coming back home to the family. And of course, during the pandemic and lockdown in Australia and New Zealand, especially, there's no escape from the family, right? They're there every day. So I wonder, Yinn Chen, if you might want to make some comments about your assertions very early on, or even before the pandemic, and what you see now as this role of the family in creating identity on holidays.
Hi, Joseph. Thanks for the question, and thanks everyone for having me here. Currently working with the Singapore Civil Service. I'm really happy to take time off from the 9 to 6 to meet with all of you for this Zoom conference. So I think I must caveat first that in Singapore, because we're such a small island, it is so common for Singaporeans to take annual holidays. I'm sure Hung Lu does this with her kids prior to the pandemic, and so did I, which is why the research was also based on an autoethnography of my own family's holidays. So that's an interesting methodology that you could read up on in the paper too. So I think what was a really interesting finding from the paper is that Singaporean families are actually not traveling to escape from home. They were actually escaping to this very romanticized, idealized version of the nuclear family, and that was produced on holiday through the photographs they take and also through the care work practices that they do on holiday, which typically in Singapore would be outsourced, in fact, to their foreign domestic workers that live at home, or to the grandparents who are also encouraged to take care of their children. So I think given the COVID-19 pandemic, where none of these family holidays can happen anymore, then there seems to be this yearning to perform the family, but there's no longer this holiday space that families can go on to perform the family. And with work and school kind of intruding into the home space even further, I think that's where Singaporean families are really trying to produce this idea of the family through domestic tourism, for example, staycations, or even going on cruises, because these are the only options that are available to us now. I just wanted to point out the irony that recently I actually facilitated a series of citizen engagement focus groups about how do we make Singapore more conducive for families. And the Zoom background that I'm using now is actually from that series of citizen engagement. So it kind of even reinforces the fact that, is Singapore conducive for families, or do we need to travel in order to find that idealized version of home that is made through separating ourselves from the mundane everyday routines that we do. And even more so now that, chores and domestic work and care work is part of the home space, and there's no longer this separation. So I just thought that, yeah, it's really ironic that COVID has brought out the findings even more. Maybe I'd just like to invite Hung Lu to just add on from your positionality as a mother, right? How do you think the findings have changed?
Okay, so as usual, Shan is such a great student. I don't think I have anything much to add on to already. But I would just definitely say that the idea that you have to go on holiday to find home is ever more present, because the home has been encroached by work from home or home-based learning. So it's like while we are physically at home, there is a deeper kind of innate search for that sort of romanticized home space, which in Yinn Shan's paper, we actually talked about. And maybe at this point, I will thank myself and Yinn Shan and move on to another author of ours, Ricardo. Talked about pilgrimage travel in his paper. And so, maybe what we want to ask is, how does then pilgrimage travel serve as a way to decentralize the Western-centric perspectives on Asia? And, what are the kind of implications in, again, this of COVID-related travel restrictions today?
Okay, thank you very much, and hello everybody. Yes, I did my paper was a comparison between both the Australians and Japanese visitors in a Japanese pilgrimage. And what I found very interesting is how you can see in a single place all the different values or the different perspectives on a single site emerging, right? Not only from a Western perspective, also from the local, the Japanese perspective. and how still they are very different, even in the same place, right? I found that very, very intriguing to see how a single cultural landscape, a pilgrimage, a singular sacred site could be interpreted by different people with different cultural backgrounds, with different nationalities and different motivations, right? And of course, now with the travel restrictions related to the coronavirus, at least now in Japan, well, the international tourism is almost zero. It has been almost zero for, I think, more than a year already. And I think that has been, well, of course, for the local communities in this pyramid site that were looking towards economic revitalization with pilgrimage. Now, of course, they have a very different scenario. And also, not only from an economic point of view, but also from a cultural point of view, how much even the community sometimes lose with these restrictions when they cannot interact with the international visitors. Because one of the things I found really, really interesting when I did the work was how interested were the Australians to interact with the locals. Not so much the Japanese. The Japanese were not that interested in interacting with the locals. What I thought it was going to be the opposite. Even with the language barrier, because English and Japanese is completely different, they were really interested interacting with the locals, and the locals were also very interested in interacting with the Australians, right? And how these pyramid sites always merge cultures, they merge communities, they merge different values, right? Like, especially religion in Japan has always been like this, very syncretic, merging different perspectives. Of course, now, I don't know how it's going to evolve from here on. I'm sure that the community in Kumanokodo will love to have the visitors again to receive them. But, I haven't been again to Kumanokodo since the coronavirus, but I know from asking in other sites near Kumanokodo that there is some anxiety related to health, they don't want to have, like outbreaks of coronavirus with the tourists. So I don't know how it's going to involve, these anxieties in the future.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much. Some interesting points there that kind of harks back to what Claudio was saying about the tourist as contagion, right? the dangers that they pose. So we're getting towards the end, but what I wanted to do was pose a question to Cheong. Cheong, are you there? Cheong works very heavily in Southeast Asia and is the co-author of the paper with Kathleen. I wonder if you wanted to make share some of your observations in Southeast Asia at the moment, drawing from the paper that you wrote, you co-authored with Kathleen and Mary and Jiang Fei.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks, Hangla and Mary, for this really interesting webinar. And I woke up at 6:30. I'm in Swansea, UK, and it's becoming 8:30 now. But it's very early, but it's been really, really alerting and awakening. So, Joseph, when I started writing the paper last May or June, I was very hopeful. I thought this crisis will shake up the existing problems in Southeast Asia and change the government's minds. They'll focus more on tourism, especially cultural tourism or pilgrimages, small businesses. So when I was writing that, I was very in a positive mind, and I was observing so many creative initiatives from community level, like Kathleen mentioned earlier, and that was amazing. And also Southeast Asia has been like playground for international tourists, and domestic tourists were, not giving much attention, and they're mostly like serving tourists, which was absolutely wrong, right? So last summer, I also saw my domestic, not domestic tourist friends, but Southeast Asian friends, they're enjoying their tourist facilities. They say, finally, without tourists, they're very, very happy. And they say everything's got very cheap. and things got cheaper because of no wasn't tourists. So they're very happy enjoying their own resources and tourism attractions. So I thought it was, oh, this is a positive turning point. But now, after 1 year later, I'm less hopeful. I'm more quite negative mind right now, because nothing really happened or changed. Okay, there were creative initiatives from community level. It was really, really interesting and inspiring, but they didn't sustain. It was just a one-time thing or just a 1 month thing. So now I'm talking to industry people actually daily basis on WhatsApp. They're all very less hopeful and more negative toward the tourism industry and recovery, which is very sad. And one of the problems is actually the government and tourism authorities. They were, I thought this would shake up the existing problems and structure, but it didn't happen. And I was involved in small business creative initiative project in Bali and some in Vietnam. And there were very interesting ideas and innovative creative ideas, but it couldn't sustain because of lack of support from government. And also, like Kathleen mentioned earlier, when we talk about community, that's not really like, you know, one kind of people. There are layers of people with local elites and, you know, all kind of other peoples, and there's lots of conflict. And that's why our project couldn't carry on. And also one of the reasons it couldn't carry on or sustain was lack of training, how to organize products, organize tourism programs. So there definitely need training from government or tourism authority level, and there is not there. So I'm definitely less hopeful about tourism recovery in Southeast Asia. And one solution could be really government attention and support and training programs. And again, my Southeast Asian, especially small business owner friends is saying, we don't need the financial support. We're not too interested in money or cash support subsidies, but we want training. So they want training and they need training for recovery and sustaining any idea they have. So that's, yeah.
Thanks very much, Cheong. Good to hear from you. The last time I spoke to Cheong, she was in Korea, and now she's in Wales.
Oh, yeah, in Swansea.
Yes, not so immobile like the rest of us. But okay, I think we've overstayed our time with you all, and thank you very much for all for joining us. Most of all, thanks to the participants. If you want to know more about what the speakers have been talking about, please look at their papers in volume 23, number 4 of Tourism Geographies. Thank you to our keynotes, Tim and Kathleen. I know it's very, very late for you. We really appreciate you sticking around. Thank you also to TC in Singapore. It's a bit more a civilized time for you, but thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to, and I'm just looking at the list of authors now. Chris Gibson's video we won't play because we've run out of time, but we will include it online when we send out the link to the webinar. Thanks to Kathleen, Hazel, and Stuart, TC, Chang again, Claudio and Maartje, thank you. You can go and have your coffee and breakfast now. Yinn, Shan, thank you for taking the time out of work. Regina and Gabriel. Gabriel, thanks for joining us early in your morning as well. Regina, thanks. Good night. Sleep well. Nicole and Ken Seng, Nicholas and Kumi, Mary, Jasmine and Carol, Ian, Kathleen, Jayon, Mary, and Jung T, Fee, and Tim once again. Thank you all. Really, I've enjoyed this. I hope you have as well. And it's almost like a conversation in 3 parts: pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and the next one we will have is post-pandemic. Let's see if things changed again, right? So once again, thanks everyone. Hope to see you in Vietnam, December 2022. It will happen, Jayon. Don't be so pessimistic. Bye everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Hi, it's Chris Gibson here, taking the opportunity to speak to you on a video about my contribution to the special issue of Tourism Geographies. I'm sorry I can't be there live on the camera, as it were, but there's a clash that I can't avoid with teaching that I have on at the moment, so it's the best I can do. It is great to have an opportunity to at least say a few things about this paper. It's now a couple of years since I wrote the original piece for the conference from which the special issue came. I was really fortunate to be invited to give a keynote at that conference. And so the paper that I've contributed has a look and feel about it that reflects that keynote. And it was really an attempt to try and take stock of where critical work in tourism studies has taken us to. Since just over a decade ago, I had the opportunity to write a series of review essays on the topic. So it has a particular look and feel that's less about an Asia Pacific perspective on tourism studies, or it's less around, you know, how general types of trends in tourism studies is localized in the Asia Pacific, and more around what a critical tourism studies perspective looks like in general, theorizing from this place. One of the things that's always annoyed me as a researcher working from Australia, where I live, and from the Asia Pacific region, is the way in which often we're compelled to somehow explain what is happening in tourism studies in our neck of the woods in relation to purportedly global or universal theories that often themselves have come from quite specific contexts in North America or Europe. And so for me, this paper was an opportunity to sort of intervene a little bit in that, to suggest that theory making is itself cosmopolitan, and from this part of the world has a particular look to it. And in trying to do that, it was an attempt, in this paper, it's an attempt to dwell with and think about theories of the Anthropocene, which in a more broad context have loomed large in my home discipline of geography, and also resonate very strongly in this context in Australia, having seen unprecedented extreme weather events and disasters, many of which have been aggravated by climate change in recent years, that have profound implications for everybody and everything, not just for tourist or tourism, but trying to mesh that with where critical geography has taken us in the last decade. So it's an attempt to theorize critical tourism studies, but do so in a way that's less about a universalizing frame than a perspective that emerges from a particular context. What's been particularly, I don't know if ironic is quite the right word, or poignant or bizarre, is to actually look, just had a look back at the paper the other day, since it was published online quite a while ago, and to think about it in light, obviously, of the pandemic and everything that's happened since. There's elements, I think, of the paper that are interesting and useful to thinking through the post-pandemic or tourism scene, or to think about tourism in the midst of pandemic, and other bits that now seem woefully quaint and out of date, given that so much has happened. And there is a strange irony, I think it's an irony, about sitting here at the front of my house, recording this little lecture, while here in Sydney we are in a hard lockdown, where I can't actually physically, legally move beyond a 10-kilometre boundary of this site here, let alone get on a plane or take a train interstate, or travel even overseas for a holiday. The prospects of doing that now seem very remote, where here in Australia we've had particularly robust responses to the pandemic in terms of limitations, enforced police intervention, enforced limitations on human mobility. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting and kind of emotional, in lots of ways, resonances between this paper and the situation we now find ourselves in. So I could just see a plane taking off here. It's an Air Canada plane. So I actually happen to live near Sydney Airport. what do I think of that? It's weird because there's probably not many people on it. It'll be a mostly empty plane with just people moving around for essential reasons, and probably the reason why that plane is still taking off is more to do with the freight, the things that are in the cargo hold of the plane rather than the people that might otherwise have been on it. Anyway, so I've rambled a bit, but I hope that provides a little bit of a sense of context to this paper. Yeah, I hope you enjoy the symposium and the keynotes and presentations from others involved in it. It was a real thrill to be involved all the way through from the conference through to the actual special issue coming together, and it's fantastic to see it happen, and I really congratulate the organisers and the editors for making it happen, persevering with everything that's gone on in the world since.